Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Today's episode, we examine the Battle of Newmarket and its VMI Cadets, the Forgotten Ones. Virginia Military Institute cadets working cannons rising to the occasion, paving the way for a startling Confederate victory in May of 1864. For any shortcomings Union Major General Julius Stahl may have had as an officer, his courage, at least, seemed beyond reproach. A native of Hungary, Stahl had served with the U.S. Army since the war's outset, helping form its first German-American regiment, the 8th New York Infantry, and then seeing action in the First Bull Run campaign. Despite the Union setback at Cross Keys during Stonewall Jackson's celebrated 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign, Stahl received a guard as
brave and enthusiastic, seen during the day in the thickest of the fight, encouraging and urging on his men.
Further commendation would come in August for his efforts with the Army of Virginia at Second Bull Run, yet another Federal defeat in that calamitous second year of the war. On May 15, 1864, the 38-year-old commander found himself engaged at the important Shenandoah Valley crossroads town of Newmarket. Serving as cavalry commander of Major General Franz Sigel's Department of West Virginia, Stahl was being counted on to play a prominent part in Ulysses S. Grant's three-pronged conquest against Richmond that spring. As Grant's overland campaign pushed through central Virginia toward the Confederate capital and Major General Benjamin Butler advanced up the peninsula from Norfolk, it was the task of Sigel's army to further disrupt the rebel defenses and keep resources and reinforcements away from Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Though relatively small in scale, the Battle of Newmarket was a signature in many ways. Most famous were the contributions of the Virginia Military Institute's Corps of Cadets, called into the fray out of desperation by Major General John C. Breckinridge, and ultimately playing a role in a stunning Confederate triumph. For Breckinridge, Newmarket would be a particularly welcome success, coming in the wake of hard-luck Western theater setbacks early in the war at battles such as Stone's River and Chattanooga. Breckinridge handled his force adroitly against Sigel's vast army, nearly twice the size of his. There were Union heroes, too. Medal of Honor recipient James N. Burns of the 1st West Virginia. Captain Henry A. DuPont, Battery B, 5th U.S. Artillery. Colonel Jacob Campbell. Lieutenant George Gageby. And Captain Edwin J. Keisinger of the 54th Pennsylvania, just to name a few. What remains uncertain is how exactly Sigel allowed what probably should have been a comfortable victory get away from him. The incessant rain and stormy weather in which the armies clashed figured as major culprits, of course, as did Sigel's seeming command complacency and lack of urgency in reaching Newmarket ahead of the Confederates. Breckinridge's ability to do so allowed him to dictate critical aspects of the pending showdown. Often overlooked in assessing the battle, however, is Stahl's mindset on May 15th and how greatly it impacted the result. Early in the morning, even with the action unsettled and the weather worsening, Sigel's significant advantage in numbers still offered promise of a Union victory. Yet Stahl, his cavalry aligned a few miles behind the Union left flank on the Valley Turnpike, was growing increasingly restless. Not known as a bystander, the Hungarian finally decided that action was needed and ordered an ill-advised, full-blown charge. The domino effect from that would cost Sigel's army dearly. cavalry had yet to be a major factor. Earlier in the day, Confederate Colonel John Imboden's troopers had moved east of Smith's Creek along with McClellan's battery to enfilade the Union flank. Fire from McClellan's guns forced the withdrawal of Union cavalry and Alfred von Kleisler's battery, but when Imboden later attempted to cross back across the creek to get behind the Federals, the swollen waters proved too great an obstacle.
It was raining hard for the last hour. The ground was soaked. We were on low ground, and there were puddles of water everywhere about us,
grumbled Jacob Lester, the 1st New York Veteran Cavalry, adding that he and his comrades soon
got orders to draw a saber, and I knew we were to charge. Horses got stuck in the mud and fell over each other, and in a moment we were mired up like a flock of sheep.
The order from Stahl was in response to an apparent advance on his right by Confederate Brigadier General John Eccles' brigade and the dismounted 62nd Virginia Mounted Infantry. As Sarah K. Briel states in Call Out the Cadets,
Stahl decided the cavalry had been inactive enough for one day and concocted a grand scheme fit for a Napoleonic battlefield, but which would not translate well on the Valley Pike.
Stahl, who had first gained notice fighting during the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 and 1849, had long studied and admired such Napoleonic tactics, but the general clearly misjudged in believing an all-out charge on this terrain and under these conditions would succeed. In addition to the mud, a ravine with broken ground lay ahead of the Federal horsemen, and the Valley Pike featured low stone walls that would funnel them into a compressed front and leave them easy targets for the Confederate guns. It is possible Stahl had no idea how great a threat he faced. Even then, it might not have been enough to make him reconsider. The rain and low-lying battlefield smoke greatly hindered visibility, and Breckinridge, deducing a likely charge, had aligned his men perfectly. The Confederate position was formed into a defensive V, 3 batteries in the center, the 22nd Virginia Infantry on the left, and the 23rd Virginia Battalion on the right. Jackson's battery was just west of the pike, positioned behind the 62nd Virginia. Included in the assembly of cannons on so-called Battery Heights were 2 guns manned by VMI Cadets, lined up behind a partially demolished rock fence. Under the command of Lieutenant Collier M. Hinge, a fellow cadet, they would be the first from the Institute to see combat and would not disappoint, handling their guns like seasoned professionals.
We got quickly into action with canister,
Minge recalled,
and the smoke cleared away. The cavalry seemed to have been completely broken up.
The collective Confederate firepower brought a quick end to Stahl's brazen charge. Stahl sent forth roughly 1,000 horses, but the lead elements never got close to the Confederate guns, cut down en masse in the middle of the road. As Rand Noyes of the 22nd Virginia later wrote,
only one man on an unmanageable horse came through.
The 1st New York rallied for a second attempt, but was quickly undone by friendly fire.
They were ready for us,
lamented Sergeant William A. McElhenney of the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, also known as Cole's Cavalry.
Our battalion marched directly into their artillery fire. Shells were dropping all around us, and musket balls were whistling. The rebels were so close that we could see their long gray line of infantrymen advancing. Where were our regiments of infantry? The rebel infantry was nearing gunshot range. Just as they started firing, a regiment of our men arrived. We fell back for them to form in line, but it was too late. The rebels were upon us, firing at close range. They mowed our men down like grass. Our cavalry tried to keep together, but were impeded by the retreating infantrymen escaping from the hot fire of Breckinridge's pursuing men. Many of them didn't escape. All the way to the Shenandoah River, they were hot on our heels.
Recalled Lester.
Shell from the rebel artillery struck a man at my side, carrying away half of his head and splattering his brains, hair, and whiskers all over the right side of me. The same shell carried away the left shoulder and arm of a man in front of me and struck another man farther on, square in the back, passed through, and as he toppled from his horse, I saw his whole front torn open, a tarn of blood flowing from it.
In a June 1908 letter to Confederate Colonel George M. Edgar, Mensch reminisced about the remarkable history his cadets had made.
We were hurried down to position number 3 on the right and just off the Turnpike Road. Here we got quickly into action with canister against cavalry charging down the road and adjacent fields. I think all the guns McLaughlin had were thrown down to this point. I remember the artillery aided the infantry very materially against the last bold move of the enemy. When the smoke cleared away, the cavalry seemed to have been completely broken up, and we saw no more of them to the close. I have heard that the conduct of the boys composing the section was commended by both General Breckinridge and the Major. Dear old Colonel Gillem said some nice things about us, but his love for us would have overlooked our faults if we had committed any. Major Thomas N. Semmes of the Institute was charged with the responsibility of seeing that we did not run away, and I have been told that he had some very kind words for us.
McIlhenny had questioned the absence of Union infantry support during the failed cavalry attack. As it turned out, the 54th Pennsylvania was nearby, positioned next to the Valley Pike on terrain Minge referred to in his letter as a dale, featuring rolling hills and a group of low cedar trees. Aligned to the 54th's immediate right was the 1st West Virginia Infantry, which in turn was flanked by the 34th Massachusetts Infantry. The dreadful conditions and battle chaos, however, created uncertainty for all 3 of those regiments, and uncoordinated advances started after 3 p.m. would turn particularly dire for the 54th Pennsylvania. Earlier in the war, the 54th had seen duty primarily in defense of a stretch of B&O Railroad between Cumberland, Maryland, and what would become Martinsburg, West Virginia. Newmarket would be one of the regiment's first true engagements, and it would hit the Keystone State Boys hard. In approximately 2 hours of fighting, the 54th suffered 174 casualties, nearly 31% of its 566-man strength. To their credit, the Pennsylvanians remained engaged for some time before being forced to retreat from the field. At one point, Sigel's Union lines had stretched roughly more than a mile west from Smith's Creek to the North Fork of Shenandoah River, just north of Jacob Busham's prosperous farmstead. The fighting had progressed west following Stahl's failed charge, and the 54th Pennsylvania struggles on the ground and became labeled the Bloody Cedars. A Federal position on a rise next to the river, however, remained relatively strong, manned by the artillery units of Captains Alonzo Snow, John Carlin, and Alfred von Kleisler, as well as the elements of the 34th Massachusetts and 1st West Virginia. Sigel wanted the 54th Pennsylvania, 1st West Virginia, and 34th Massachusetts to advance in junction. That would not happen. The 1st covered about 100 yards before falling back, leaving the 54th and the 34th isolated on its flanks. When a gap opened in the Confederate line around the Bushong farm, fear grew that the Federals would exploit it. To this point, Breckinridge had held the cadets in reserve, reluctant to send them in. Urged on by an aide, Major Charles Semple, he finally relented.
Put the boys in, and may God forgive me for that order.
The cadets' advance down an incline toward the Bushong house began ominously as a Federal shell exploded in their midst, killing 3, William Cable, Charles Crockett, and Henry Jones. Fears that the cadets might run were promptly put to rest, though, even after another cadet, William McDowell, was shot and killed, and several others were wounded. The VMI boys joined the line of Brigadier General Gabriel C. Wharton's brigade around the Bushong farm. Their position was receiving steady fire from von Kleisler's batteries, as well as the 34th Massachusetts and 1st West Virginia. A stealth advance along the river by members of the 51st Virginia and the trailing 26th Virginia put Snow's and Garland's guns in jeopardy, however, and fire from the Confederate right produced significant Federal casualties. The 300 or so yards of elevated ground that directly separated the cadets and von Kleisler's guns were caked with ankle-deep mud. It would prove no deterrent in the least. Their bayonets fixed, the cadets suddenly surged forward. Even when several lost their shoes in the muck and were forced to proceed barefoot, the momentum was unstoppable. Likewise, impeded by the muddy terrain, von Kleisler's uneasy men struggled to shift back their battery's 6 guns. When the relentless cadets overran his position, von Kleisler would lose one of his guns. Then he was forced to abandon a second, its wheels mired in the mud. The Union position atop the ridge collapsed, and the fraught Federals retreated toward Mount Jackson, eventually crossing the North Fork of the Shenandoah and burning the lone bridge there to stop the pursuing Confederates. It had been a spectacular, well-deserved victory, but for the triumphant Confederates, it would only delay the inevitable. A few days later, Grant removed Sigel from command. In June, Sigel's replacement, Major General David Hunter, torched the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington before advancing toward Lynchburg. Stahl continued as commander of the department's cavalry, and his efforts at the Battle of Piedmont on June 5th earned him a wound and a Medal of Honor. He resigned from the Army in February of 1865. Union Major General Philip Sheridan eventually assumed command of what became the Army of the Shenandoah and unleashed a campaign of devastation upon the region's bountiful agricultural resources. The burning, as it was infamously known in Southern hearts. Sheridan's victory at Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, marked the effective end of any Confederate military hopes in this once critical theater of war. It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.